What I want to give is a little bit of a presentation of what I think is working and what's not working. I also want to give structural reasons as to why I think things are truly different and what that structure implies, and then give, in the end, 3 solutions what I think some of these problems are. So to highlight some of the things that I think folks are already familiar with, I like using this particular example, Amazon calling safe on one of its players wiping out a competitor because it's a judge, jury, and executioner in its own marketplace. And we look at Amazon using merchant data to enter the merchant markets, or Google using advertiser data to bid against third parties. So they have an informational advantage. And without going into the details of this, we're seeing this across the board. So we're seeing concerns in Europe, we're seeing it in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, and fascinatingly, it hasn't been mentioned much today, but also in China. They're also intervening heavily in the platforms. For reference, we're seeing legislation, even in just the last term, introduced by a large number of different congressmen to reduce the switching costs, to reduce the discriminatory contact, or remove the conflicts of interest. One that's particularly interesting, but perhaps damaging, is just outright banning the entry of platforms into adjacent marketplaces. Is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And why would that be the case? I want to summarize some of the thinking. So we have before us some existing legislation. So if we look at the Digital Markets Act, and we look across the newly proposed legislation in the United States, some of the things I think are quite good. Eliminating the most favored nation clauses so that can get competition off platform. Increasing advertising transparency, fair uninstall of apps. I must say there's some apps that come native on the iPhone I really would like to swap out. Google Maps is much better. Friend access, interoperability of data. Also really interesting is that merchants are disintermediated from their own customer data. So I think those are all things that do need to be fixed. Take a look at some things I think aren't working well based on the structure. One is forbidding the combination of data sources without explicit opt-in. This would reduce the ability to create network effects. Another one is the ability of platforms to enter their merchants' markets. In any other market, we welcome competition because that's actually good for consumers. Here, it's perhaps the unfairness. So can we get the best of both? Can we get the competition, but also the fairness? I'm also going to highlight a couple of issues about data portability that I think we can actually handle much better. The idea is to create competition, but I think we can not only create the competition, but we can also create the wealth. Then I think we can do a better job with mergers and market entry as well. At its core, I want to start with a somewhat different question. So I believe that what competition authorities are currently asking is this issue, and I've heard this directly quoted, how do we create competition, fair contestable markets, and restore user business control over data that affects them? When I think the question really needs to be somewhat different, how do we create value and foster innovation and divide that fairly? One of the chief issues is, again, this difference between rival versus non-rival resources. In traditional antitrust in old markets for steel and oil and dollars or autos, those are rival resources, so carving them up and creating competition works to create value. But for a non-rival resource, splitting it up means you're going to reduce the network effects in this case. I'm going to go back into some of the structural changes here. I think pretty much everyone's mentioned that the GAFAM had network effects. So whether it's one person search making another better, or product recommendations making better matches, social networks, or two-sided markets, all of these manage network effects. What's interesting is that this is an externality. Externalities are going to need to be managed in the marketplaces, and they're non-rival. Again, if we carve them up, they get smaller. We're going to spread them over fewer folks. That actually destroys resources or destroys value. So I think what we need to do is to manage the structures that do create that value. So let's go back and examine the structures. So I think one of the things that's missed in the current competition law or in antitrust is that the structure has changed. We can use some really, really deep economics to show what's actually happening. So if we look at 2 Nobel Prizes given originally on transactions cost economics, these are described the nature of markets and the nature of firms. What was the insight? The insight that came out of this, and this again was the original antitrust logic, transactions costs are the sum of the search, coordination, negotiation, information asymmetry costs. If the total costs of production and transactions cost is lower inside the firm, then you make the good, else you buy the good. And that effectively decides the boundary between the vertically integrated firm and the marketplace. And often what we're doing in antitrust authorities is to then divide up these assets, especially as transactions costs are lowering. So you want to create more competition. So you divide it up and you have more market-based interactions. In more recent versions of this same thing, by the way, this also goes to the own versus rent decision as opposed to just the make versus buy decision. And this could explain some of the attributes of Airbnb and Uber and others. But there's a second set of ideas that's missed in this basic story between markets and hierarchies. That's externalities. So Coase won the second aspect of his Nobel Prize is again for the management of externalities. And the original insight there was interfering radio spectrum. And you need to internalize those, or can you actually put those into the marketplace in one way or another? Well, so we've just observed all of the platform firms deal in externalities. They deal in spillovers. What's fascinating about this is individual externalities are too small to trade in the marketplace. So if your Google search makes my Google search better, we can't trade that in the marketplace. Or one person's Amazon recommendation makes another Amazon's purchase better and improve those experiences. These externalities are too small for you and I to buy and sell. What that means is that we need a different structure that internalizes them to make them better. That's the platform. That's neither market nor hierarchy. That's the intuition. So together with Jeff Parker, we actually tried to prove this formally. So this was actually a line of research in management science. It's actually quite the idea. So imagine developers could, this thing is between data and code. Imagine developers could build on each other's code or they could sell it. Now, everyone would like to build on everyone else's code. That's a positive externality to make their own code more efficient, but they also want to sell. If you sell it, then you can't build on it because it's private. So you actually reduce the amount of spillover that you get. What we find is that orchestration, where somebody internalizes the spillover and then makes that information valuable to all of them, actually improves the marketplace. And what winds up happening is that orchestration dominates both vertical production and market-based production. It's a different form of organization that suggests by internalizing the spillovers, you can actually create an intellectual property rights regime where you create an economy that actually creates more value. So that's the theory, but we have tons of evidence to support it. Let me give you a couple of great stories that you'll all be familiar with. So take Napster. This was a free marketplace for songs. I have to give Munger credit for pointing out this observation. Apple then comes in and it then does the orchestration, and we don't even think about Napster anymore. Now you use Apple or Spotify or another service, and they've taken the transactions cost out and done such a good job of quality control that even that one-to-one peer-to-peer market exchange is now dominated by a nexus, which is a platform in there. And in fact, they've actually managed it. Or if we take a look at what happened in the marketplace of Austin when Uber and Lyft left. What happened there is that Austin was going to require certain regulation in terms of certification, and Uber and Lyft temporarily left the city. So what happened? You might think then that the coordinated market would be more efficient. That's not what actually happened. A bunch of drivers lost their jobs, but then everyone re-coordinated on Facebook where riders would post their location, drivers would respond in the comment field, they negotiate price, and you pay with Cash, Square, or PayPal. What was interesting is then the individuals, not the platform, would bear the risk of whether or not the other party is a felon or throws up in the car. Dispatch was not necessarily based on proximity. Volume fell dramatically. Interestingly enough, because there's no 30% cut or 20% cut to the driver's share goes up and folks are willing to tip generously. So drivers in that sense benefited, but the total volume of transactions fell dramatically. And DWI arrests went up 7.5%. So imagine each driver setting their own prices in negotiation. That in effect, has created more competition, but it's not necessarily more efficient than the platform orchestration. The point is platform orchestration can internalize those externalities and be more efficient than pure markets themselves, which is often what the competition authorities are pushing towards and break up with the division of assets. So what's to be done? So I agree, there are some real problems that we do need to address. So how would we do this? Let me give you 3 ideas. All right, so idea number 1. All right, so 3 solutions. The first solution is to create fair access to the same infrastructure and data so that we get the same levels of competition. Suppose that what we do is you create a fair legal and technical firewall, easily handled with APIs and with Chinese walls and infrastructure. What this does is it separates the apps on the top from the infrastructure on the bottom. Platforms then require, so that's the separation that takes place. Platforms are then required to publicly post the terms of access, in terms of what's it going to take for the access to the data, access to the infrastructure. And everybody gains access to the same infrastructure and the same data at the same time. That is the internal native apps and the third-party infrastructure apps. What this does is it then shares that infrastructure and data resource. So third parties gain access to that same data that the platform has at the same time. There's now efficient competitive entry, and we've covered the cost of infrastructure. So Amazon entering a market is like Google entering on top of Amazon's market, or a small startup entering. So we get the benefits of entry, but there's also fairness. There's no unfairness in terms of access to that data. So that's recommendation number 1. Second, recommendation number 2 is to look at some of the merger control. So I get it in terms of banning. Consider the example of Pinduoduo. So Alibaba tries to buy Pinduoduo, and so these are again 2 e-commerce marketplaces. This is in China. If this happens, that's dangerous, of course, because Alibaba absorbing that more powerful if that's true. But consider what happens if we ban that outright. Simply the large platforms can't do it. Tencent didn't have its own e-commerce marketplace. If Tencent actually works with Pinduoduo, now this small organization is less likely to be crushed by Alibaba because now it can tap the network that Tencent has in WeChat, and it gets financial resources. So it gets much more competitive relative to Alibaba than it is when it's not attached to another adjacent platform. Again, the issue here is that Tencent wasn't particularly an active player in the e-commerce marketplace, even though it was very active in the social. So we have to look at which markets overlap and don't. So the solution here is to look at the counterfactuals to determine which other configurations might add value. And a different partner could add more competition and, again, more network effects, which then creates the value. So again, the outright ban seems like a foolish idea. We're looking at some of these other configurations might be ways of creating considerable wealth and competition. Let's consider data portability again as this method of creating value for users and competition. I argue that data portability, as currently conceived, has a number of different flaws. One of the most important is that removing data from its location takes away context. There was a great study done by Programmable where they downloaded Facebook data, but it loses all everyone's posts. So if someone responds to your data, you respond to theirs, that's their data. So you don't get that. That's not part of the port. So it loses context. Ports are at a moment in time, so they decay, and it's depreciating stock of information. Another critical element is impotence. Once it's removed from the infrastructure, you can't share a benefit with friends, you can't receive them, you can't make a purchase. You couldn't get a coupon based on that data in the infrastructure. So it's not as potent if you take it away. And the last one I think is significantly underappreciated. Yes, I understand the argument about taking the store ratings off of Amazon so you can actually create more competition someplace else. But then stores can selectively drop their unflattering reviews, which creates consumer risk. So you've got moral hazard problems. I'd like to propose a different regime, which is an in situ access. The idea is to bring the algorithm to the data as distinct from the data to the algorithm. And it's all through user or merchant position, which addresses each of those problems. First, complete context is preserved. So others' posts are there, your posts and third-party contact all remains intact. It's fresh, it's always current, so you get to see whatever is there and update it. Privacy is actually dramatically enhanced. If somebody's behaved badly and you want to turn off access, you just close the APIs. You're guaranteed they don't have to destroy the data because they never had it. They took the algorithm to the data and you're protected. It retains its potency. Data in situ is actionable. Benefit can be shared or received according to the existing infrastructure. And it's low hazard. You can't selectively edit unflattering reviews as a merchant, and so you reduce the risk of transactions taking place on the platform. There's even one further benefit of this that I think is dramatically underappreciated, of the in situ access. Many of you may have followed it in the news recently, that Facebook shut down access of German and New York University researchers to Facebook, and they had been granted access by users. So they'd be able to install an app to actually see what ads people were saying, what misinformation was going. And Facebook terminated that access. They even got a scolding from the FTC. What's interesting is that only Facebook knows the extent of its misinformation problem. They're not even sharing with the White House. If users had in situ data rights, you could grant that NYU or German access or anyone that you chose. We could then learn, have platforms influenced elections or reduced vaccinations, aided insurrection or abetted balkanization. What this does is it gives a mechanism for oversight on the data where it's resident, right? It enables benchmarking, price comparison, oversight that the platforms have actively sought to avoid. So we think this in situ data right is far more powerful in giving, in creating competition, and also enabling oversight. So I think this is a way to actually do it. At its heart, I'm simply making, on these three recommendations, one basic observation. The issue is creating value and dividing it fairly, not creating competition and dividing it badly. So I think we need to, and the reason at its heart is externalities need to be internalized in a way that create value. Information and these network effects are non-rival resources, so we should share them as opposed to carve them up. And I think that's the main insight by which we should be operating on these different recommendations. So for those of you that are interested, we have a new article forthcoming on in situ data rights. It's coming out in the next couple of months. And I think, as Michael Jacobides mentioned, we have some work on platform bidders and antitrust and some commentary on several of these things. If you're interested in the proof that the structure, the platforms beat vertical integration or markets, and there's the management science paper, Innovation, Openness, and Platform Control. And of course, there's an older paper on platform envelopment about how platforms move into adjacent markets, perhaps even with some inferior technologies. All these things I think are relevant to the case of antitrust. So with that, let me stop and Carmelo, see if there happen to be any questions.
Thank you.